Hello, and welcome back to Dark Tower YouTube, where we're taking a deep psychological dive into Stephen King's magnum opus, The Dark Tower. My name is Michelle McEwen. I am your host, and I'm really glad to be with you here today talking about Chapter 4 of The Gunslinger, The Slow Mutants. This is a big chapter. This is a defining chapter in the book, as you well know, because this week we will get another flashback into Roland's childhood and learn how he became a man. No, not that one, the other story. We will dip our toes into the horror genre and meet the Slow Mutants, and we will say goodbye to our friend Jake. It's a big one. I'm going to do it in two parts because I have a lot to pick out and talk about. So I don't want to keep you here for hours and hours. So there'll be a part 1 of chapter 4 and a part 2 of chapter 4. So make sure you're watching them in order so that it all makes sense. We left off with chapter 3, where the gunslinger had uncoupled from Jake, and immediately after, the darkness swallowed them. So they're moving into the darkness of the mountain. We're going to talk about that uncoupling throughout this chapter. We're also going to be looking at the light and dark imagery, because that theme that we started noticing in the last chapter is really picking up steam as we move ahead this time. So to start the chapter, King writes, he, Roland, had not looked back at the light as they passed into the land beneath the mountains. But the boy had. The gunslinger had read the failing of day in the soft mirror of Jake's cheek. Now faint rose, now milk glass, now pallid silver, now the last dusk glow touch of evening. Now, nothing. The gunslinger had struck a false light, and they moved on. So we are seeing the light dying in Jake's face, and that's not the only time it happens in this chapter. We're really being set up to lose our friend Jake, but we don't want to believe it. It's such a subversion of the usual narratives in stories like this. Plus, we know that Roland loves this boy. And we have been empathizing with him and sitting with him and feeling like he's human and he's having conflicting emotions based on how he was raised and what happened to him and patterns of thinking, just like we all do. So we'll continue to have empathy for Roland in this episode, hard as it's getting. I do love how it says the gunslinger had struck a false light. And that really sets us up for what's to come in this chapter, because it's not a Roland that we've really seen before. He is talking nonstop, which is not like him. And it's disingenuous. What's happening here? Why is he doing this? Why won't he shut up? A couple of theories. One is that he wants to try and make things right with Jake. So perhaps some evidence that I've uncoupled from him is not really true after all. The second reason would be he's telling us these things to justify what he's about to do to Jake. So telling Jake and telling the reader, and none of it's working for any of us, as we'll see as we go along. But it is a false light in Roland. His real light is that he loves this kid and does not want to do any of this, really, really deep down in his soul. And then he does it anyway. So what do we do with you, Roland? What are we going to do with you, my friend? The uncoupling, though, is just not a thing. Roland continues to look after Jake in this chapter and saves him a few times. So the whole thing of like, You're dead to me. I have nothing to do with you anymore. What a big lie. What a big fat lie. He couldn't do it because it's just not true. And we do that ourselves, as I might have mentioned before in the last chapter. But usually when we do that, it's because we really, really want things to be okay. We just don't see any other way out in the moment. We feel trapped. And that's usually why we move into that kind of all or nothing thinking. And it doesn't usually work out for anybody. So we're traveling with Roland and Jake into the darkness, and Roland is looking back to the light in his own way here. So it says he does not look back to the light. However, he's looking back in memory to a very lighted hall. So he's remembering this great hall where the gunslingers would gather and dance, and everyone was dressed up. And Roland is thinking about how these adults were playing games. And that's going to be a theme that we see throughout this chapter as well. The idea that adults aren't better and they don't really ever grow up and they just become more manipulative. So both of our characters are going to have things to say about that. So Roland's talking and talking and talking, but King calls out something that Roland does not say. King writes, "Once there was a king. He might have told the boy. The eld, whose blood, attenuated though it may be, still flows in my veins. But kings are done, lad, in the world of light, anyway." So he is related to Arthur Eld in some way, so that's cool. So we had our suspicions that Arthur was more than just a legend in Roland's world, but now we find that this is his great-great-great-great-grandfather. We don't know how far back it goes, but he's claiming to be related to King Arthur. But he doesn't want to tell Jake that. Why not? Well, we can come up with some pretty good guesses here, because when you read about King Arthur and Camelot and the Knights of the Holy Grail, there's not a story where King Arthur drops the little kid down the well to get to the chalice. That didn't happen because that's not the kind of king that Arthur was. So Roland's saying the kings are done in the world of light anyway. It's such an interesting thing there because you have Arthur's blood in you. So are they done? And well, there's no more kings in the world of light. And we've heard about that Crimson King from Sylvia Pittston early on. And so we're wondering about, what about the world of darkness? Who's the king in the world of darkness? And don't we need a king in the world of light if we have any chance of winning, whatever that looks like? So we understand why that is something he does not tell Jake about. So he keeps talking about the ballroom, though, and here is what Roland has to say about the grown-ups in that situation. King writes, "They made something decadent out of it," the gunslinger said at last. "A play, a game." And in his voice was all the unconscious distaste of the ascetic and the eremite. His face, had there been stronger light to illuminate it, would have shown harshness and sorrow, the purest kind of condemnation. So here is Roland up on his high horse, and those two words, ascetic and eremite, are words with religious connotation. So ascetic means practicing self-denial for religious or spiritual reasons, and eremite is a hermit, a recluse, especially of the religious kind. So those words in the context of this book, and we know there's so much religious and spiritual themes running throughout this, those two words are not an accidental choice on King's part. And they do put Roland in this position of holier than thou here. So he really is judging these folks hardcore. He's like, they're the worst. They're just playing games. And he doesn't like it. But what a hypocrite. Well, there's so much more about this in this chapter, but what a hypocrite, Roland. And usually when we're doing things like that, catch yourself when you're up on your high horse, holier than thou soapbox. Are you doing the thing that you're yelling at other people about? Are you? Sometimes. So we get to Roland's story about how Marten, the sorcerer, seduced his mother. And this happened at one of these ballroom events. The kids, the gunslinger in training people, are up in the balcony looking down on the action, and it's this decadent affair, beautiful outfits. Marten, this dark sorcerer, is in this hall of light and moving between Roland's mother and his father, and Marten takes Gabrielle, we're going to talk about her name in a minute, out onto the dance floor, and they do this dancing with the stars routine, and everybody backs up and everyone is clapping and cheering. And the gunslingers, though, are not clapping and cheering because they're watching this and saying, this is not okay. This is a servant stealing the king's wife. They see this as a cuckoldry, and they're not cool with what's happening here. So of course the gunslingers in training are noticing all of this, and they're not okay with it either. Especially Roland is not okay with this. So Gabrielle Varys, Gabrielle is the female form of the name Gabriel, and Gabriel is that angel who appears in a few different religious traditions. Notably, he's the angel who shows up to tell Mary that she's going to give birth to a king. So maybe it's nothing, but interesting little connection there. So Gabrielle is the French form of that Hebrew name Gabriel, and it means mighty woman of God. Varys, which is her maiden name, is from the Latin verus, and that means true. So we have a mighty woman of God who is also true. King also tells us that she is known as Gabrielle of the waters. And why throw that in? Who cares? Well, when we're looking through our psychological lens at all of this, we pick up on that, and we know that the waters in religious traditions, spirituality, I suppose in psychology, to some extent, we could use these examples, but really in spirituality, we talk about the tarot cards, for instance. We have the suit of cups, and that is representing water and emotion. And in the Bible, the waters are a huge representation of what's going on internally. So when we have, he leads me beside the still waters, yeah, that's the good stuff, versus we're out in a big thunderstorm and people are getting eaten by whales. We're not doing okay. So interesting that she is Gabrielle of the waters. We have more information about Stephen Deschain here, and we learn that he actually is a king. So we had our suspicions because we knew that Stephen means crown, but we didn't have any evidence. We knew that he was a gunslinger and perhaps a little higher up just based on the status of Roland, what we knew of him from the flashbacks. Excuse me. But King writes, my father had by then taken control of his quartet, you must ken, the tet of the gun, and was on the verge of becoming Din of Gilead, if not all in-world. So we know now that Stephen Deschain is a relative of King Arthur, so he has that blood running through him, but he didn't inherit this position. It said he had taken control of, which just more questions about what the political system was back in Gilead, but he has taken control of his quartet, and that was a word that we heard in all the way back in chapter 1. We didn't hear it in chapter 1. We read it in the definition of kef, and we heard about how kef, the sharing of water, is something that happens between people who are quartet, which just means people bound by destiny somehow, for good or for evil. We don't know much more about it at this point. We are starting to see that word, so I'm going to leave that for another day. But just to say that he had this group of gunslingers that he was in charge of. He had taken control of them and was on the verge of becoming the king of Gilead, if not all in world. And the word he uses is din, D-I-H-N. And we saw that back in, I think, the last chapter, when he was thinking about talking to Jake Dan Din after his experience with the oracle, opening his heart to the command of a child. So something about that word din has command within it in this language that Stephen King has made up. Not very important right now, just to say that's what we're talking about. So Stephen, the king, father of Roland, and Stephen King, creator of Roland and all of these people. He does say to Jake at this point, though, my father was the last Lord of Light. So that's the second beat we're getting of that idea. So we pay close attention when we're reading through, and we stop now and we say, come on, Roland. No, he wasn't. You are. You're his son. You're your father's son. Are you not? Don't you have the blood of this mighty king in your veins? Are you trying to just shirk that responsibility by considering sacrificing this boy for the dark tower? What's going on here? We need a Lord of the Light. We need a King of the Light if we have any chance of beating this Crimson King, I think. But Roland is really not seeing things that way. So let's see, where are we? We are learning about what happened. The treachery of Marten. Do we remember that from the Oracle, when the Oracle's like, you don't have to do this. You can save Jake. Just turn around. Go live a life where you're helping other people. Roland is like, no. The treachery of Marten. And we get, we get that ballroom scene. And we're like, oh, the treachery of Marten is equivalent to having an affair with your mom? Okay, Roland, so are you using this for justification of your quest for the tower? Because that feels a little shallow. Are you using it for justification of letting Jake die, sacrificing him? That doesn't feel great either. And Roland he's stuck here, though. He's got way big emotional baggage around this issue, and he's like bitterly ranting, oh, how they danced, and he's just going on and on. You can tell this is still sitting very heavy in his heart. So for him, the treachery of Marten is a big deal. For us, we're not really able to see things like that, and we're like, is there more to this story? Because this isn't that deep. I also am reminded of Hax, the cook, who was put to death for attempting to murder children, overthrowing the rule of the gun. And Hax was put to death. Everyone kind of agreed that that's what should happen there. He was a servant. He wasn't this high and mighty person. So just kind of thinking again, we're trying to get into Roland's mind to say, why are you going to sacrifice Jake? What's so important about all of this? And if you were so offended by what Hax was doing, can't you see that in yourself? Like, you're about to kill a child, so what's the difference? He was a servant and trying to overthrow your leadership, but now what? Like, you're a son of King Arthur, and this is a mighty sacrifice on the road to the tower, so that makes it okay. So just a lot of questions here about what is going on. Roland, how are you really trying to justify this? So all this time while Roland is talking, we're told again and again by King, the boy said nothing. He repeats that several times. So we know Jake, who figured out that this man means to kill him through his touch, his intuition, has checked out. He didn't ask Roland for any of this. He's not interested. He's not commenting, but he does speak up eventually. And did you notice where that happened? King writes, "The boy spoke at last, and with seeming reluctance. She was your mother?" So when Roland gets to the part about Gabrielle, that's where Jake wants more information. That's where he's going to finally speak up and ask Roland for more. And it reminds me of when Roland was dying in the desert, he's thinking about his mother. His thoughts are going back to his mother. He wants that comfort. He's remembering the love, the nurturing. That's what he is desperate for in what he thinks are his last moments, moving towards death. And here we have Jake, who is also in his last moments. We don't know that right now, but we know it because we finished this chapter. But he thinks he is. He thinks he's going to die, and he has no choice here but to go with this man who's going to kill him. How awful. So he wants the comfort of mother, even if it's not his own mother, just some kind of feminine love, nurturing, some kind of story of that, anything. He's desperate for it, and it's enough to make him break his silence here. So notable that is where Jake finally begins to speak. And we all need our mothers. We all need a connection with a mother, and it doesn't have to be a biological mother. This is an energy. This is a vibe. This is someone who fills that role for you, someone who gives you that nurturing. And it doesn't have to be a woman either. It usually is, but it doesn't have to be. You can have someone in your life who nurtures you, who shows you unconditional love, who is there for you in your deepest, darkest trials and tribulations. We all desperately need and want that. And we've seen how that was stripped away from the Gunslingers pretty systematically from the time that they were very small. No, you don't need your mother. No, you don't. And we get more of that here when Roland, jumping ahead a little bit here just to pull this part out, when he wins his guns, King tells us where those guns are stored. So listen to this. King writes, "In the heavy vault under the barracks, where he, by ancient law, was now required to abide, away from his mother's breast, hung his apprentice weapons, heavy, cumbersome barrel shooters of steel and nickel." So the Gunslingers are not allowed to have their moms with them at nighttime. They can still have them a little bit when they're children, but even when we get this next flashback when Roland's a teenager, he doesn't have this relationship with his mom anymore. They're kind of like distant strangers, and the conversation is pretty weird. So there's a definite distance between them even at this point. And then to say when you become an apprentice when you beat court and get some guns. You're not going to get your father's guns yet. You get your apprentice weapons. I'm not sure of the exact system here, but anyway, that's not the point. The point is they keep the guns in the barracks, the heavy barracks, heavy vault. It's a heavy vault under the barracks where now the gunslingers have to go live, away from their mother's breast. So we're just making that distance bigger and bigger. The gulf is getting wider. You can't even live in the same building as your mom. You have to move out, away from her and go live with the other big, tough men. The language in contrast there, away from his mother's breast, the heavy, cumbersome guns were sitting. So I really, on this reading, am picking up on a lot of these things that I never noticed were there before. So I hope I'm helping you pull out just how important the idea of Roland's mother and mothers in general are in this book and perhaps in the story. We shall see about that. Okay. So where are we? So he's told us all about the dance. Oh, how they danced, and did they clap when they were finished? And it's a lot. And the funny thing is that when he finishes, Jake says, "I'm tired." That's all he says. That's his reaction to that whole ranting and raving about the dance. "I'm tired." And we're tired too, Roland. Nobody is buying this. Everyone's like, why are you telling us this? We need to know it, of course, as readers, for context. What did Marten do? Why is this so linked in with Roland's quest for the man in black? And I guess Jake didn't really need to know it unless he's trying to justify this to Jake, but this isn't working, Roland. And at the end of this section, Roland goes to sleep, and we get this very sad part where King writes, "The boy opened his eyes and looked at the gunslinger with an expression of sickness and love. The last light of the fire caught in one pupil for a moment and was drowned there. He went to sleep." So there's the second time that the light is fading out of Jake's face, just really foreshadowing that he's not going to be okay here. We're still hanging on to hope, of course. An expression of sickness and love. And that is important because it helps us empathize with Jake here a little bit, to say, oh my gosh, this poor kid still loves this man. He's lovesick because he feels like he's going to be betrayed, and he ultimately is. And we feel the same way about Roland. I do. Do you? Do you have this conflicting feeling about him? Sickness and love. We want to be with Roland. We want him to do the right thing. We care about him at this point in the story. And we just feel sick because we're just being fed foreshadowing after foreshadowing about how Roland's not going to do the right thing at the end of this chapter. Now, before we move on, we're going to empathize with Roland, and it's getting harder as we move through this story. But Roland here, in this whole thing about Marten and his mom and the treachery of Marten, and we're kind of putting puzzle pieces together and being like, no, dude, like, this is about you, not about Marten. Come on. But he's become the victim of this story, and he's just blaming, it's Marten's fault that I have to do this. Marten took my mother away from my father and embarrassed the gunslingers and brought this dark force into the Hall of Light, and they danced together. It's his fault. But he's taking zero responsibility, like we've just talked about. Like, you're doing the same thing that Hax did. You're about to kill a kid. That guy danced with your mom. He had sex with your mom. Like, okay, it sucks, sure, especially if you're a kid. It's not great, but it's not even close to murder, I would argue. So you're kind of just like pointing that finger and not looking at those fingers pointing back at you, Roland. So when do we do this? All the time. Every day I'm doing this. Every day, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we're doing something like this where it's not my fault. It's the president's fault. It's the church's fault where I was brought up. It's my father's fault. My car broke down and that's why. Any external force, person, place, or thing, that is why I am this way. And that is removing our power 100%. So not only are we not taking responsibility for ourselves and our feelings and our actions and our lives, we're giving our power away. We're becoming completely powerless when we become a victim of circumstance. And I feel like that's exactly what Roland is doing here. Nobody's buying it. And we do the same thing in smaller ways. So this story, The Gunslinger, it's dramatic and it's big and it has to be. It's fiction. Our lives sometimes don't look as dramatic as that, although sometimes they might. But we can just look on the smaller scale of where we're doing that, pointing the finger, not taking self-responsibility, which doesn't work out well for us and just completely gives the power away. So it's only when you start to say, what can I do in this moment to take responsibility for my actions, that you can turn things around. You can now take your power back and have the life that you want to have. It's not up to anybody else but you to do that. So we want Roland to do that, and we want you to do that as well. We are moving deeper into the darkness. Roland keeps teasing us into believing that he's not going to do the thing. He is telling Jake, be careful, when he hears Jake has moved ahead and there's little rocks falling down from the path that they're walking on. But we're told, King says, the boy was very good in the dark, better than Roland himself. Better than Roland. Roland's been a gunslinger for how many centuries, millennia? We have no idea how old this guy is, but he's been a gunslinger for a minute. And this kid who's been in this world for a couple of weeks is better than Roland in the dark. Jake is thriving here. He is doing amazingly well. The touch has gotten stronger. He is resourceful. He is figuring problems out. He finds the handcar on the railroad tracks. He is the one who knows how to use it. He is the one who saves their butt later in the chapter when the Slow Mutants are putting the rocks on the... he's an amazing, amazing kid. So later when Roland has that vision of him actually turning around and going back, totally possible with this little gunslinger. He's already a gunslinger. He has that deep steel in him. He has that something that makes him a very formidable child and would have grown into an adult if not dropped into the pit. We get some fun little teasing from our world. We have the Amico. That was a petrol company back in the 80s and 90s. I think they were sold at some point, so they're not around anymore. But I remember there was one of those gas stations on the corner where I lived, and Amico was all over the place. So when we hear that there was an Amico pump in Roland's world and somebody was using it in like the Gods Must Be Crazy, that movie where they find the Coke bottle and then everyone's like, it's this special object. It's kind of like that, where he has this Amico pump and he's kind of putting it between his legs, which is kind of weird and funny, and everyone's going to the cult of this man. But what is that doing? That's a definite thing from our world. What is that doing in Roland's world? There's some other name drop of Hey Jude again in here. And then the hand car. So they find the hand car on the tracks and it plays commercials for us. Not in the unrevised edition. These were added to the revised edition where we get the commercials for Larchies and Crispala, soda and chips, I guess. And we don't know what those things are, but they're a thing in Roland's world. But they don't seem to fit with that desert western situation we were in at the beginning of this book. They seem to belong more to what we're going to find later in this chapter in the subway station. I bet if they had looked around, they would have seen old Crispala bags and Larchies cans. So that feels just weird, but just kind of saying there's things that belong to our world and there's there's things that don't. So Jake does find the hand car, and now they're moving way faster towards their destination, which, you know, I don't like, based on my theory about flying in chains. King says the speed and the made wind against their faces. He uses that phrase to talk about how quickly they're moving. So that makes me very nervous about what's going on. So we've talked about these Stephen King-isms. The boy found the oracle, and it almost destroyed him. And King, in his other books, that was the last time anyone saw him alive. He loves to do that to create that dramatic irony. We get another one of those thrown in here. The boy spoke less and less, but at their stopping place, one sleep period, not long before they were attacked by the Slow Mutants, he asked the gunslinger almost shyly about his coming of age. "For I would hear more of that," he said. "Why would thee sill to know that?" he asked, amused. The boy's voice was curiously stubborn, as if hiding embarrassment. "I just would." And after a pause, he added, "I always wondered about growing up. I bet it's mostly lies." So one sleep period, not long before they were attacked by the Slow Mutants. Dang it, Stephen King. And we're like, what? And now the chapter's called The Slow Mutants, so we're not that surprised. But we don't know what the Slow Mutants are. Apparently they're going to attack Roland, but now we don't go there. We're going to have to listen to this story before we get there. We're going to have to go into a flashback, which is the story that Jake is asking for. But Roland doesn't want to tell him this story. Roland is acting a lot like he was back in Brown's hut, where he kind of wanted to get this story of Tull off of his chest, but he was like starting and stopping and avoiding it, and I gotta go pee, and only told it after Brown was like, just tell me the story. So feeling kind of like that here, where Roland starts talking about some other things not related and doesn't really get to the point. And when we hear the story, we understand why, because this is the story of Roland's first sacrifice of a friend on the way to the Dark Tower. So he doesn't want to tell the story of the sacrifice to the sacrifice. No big surprise there. But he does tell the story, and he does tell it. If he really had uncoupled from Jake, again, he would not be trying to save him. Be careful. He wouldn't say that. Why would he care? He wouldn't tell this story at all. He would be like, no, I don't feel like telling you that. I don't care about you anymore. There wouldn't be conversation between these two. So he is thinking about it, and if he didn't care, he would just tell the story. But he feels guilty about it. He has a guilty conscience. Good. Yes, right. So again, we just see these sparks of that little diamond heart. The diamond in Roland's black coal heart is still there. That's another glimpse of it. Just the fact that he is reluctant to tell the story and then tells it anyway. So here's the story of Roland's coming of age. We flash back to a 14-year-old Roland who is going up to the roof of the castle to masturbate. And on his way up, he passes his mother's chambers, and Marten is in there with his mom and is like, "You boy, come in here." And Marten calls Roland boy a few times in this exchange, which is how Roland thinks about Jake. So that is something to think about, that parallel there. Also, Roland is only a few years older than Jake is in this flashback. So Roland's going to go into the room. He doesn't want to, but he kind of has to. Marten is telling him to. And we get a really awkward exchange because these two are not close anymore. He's not allowed to be close to his mom, but now this sorcerer is. So I'm going to read through this because there's a few things I want to pull out. So this is Roland in his mom's room with Marten there. King writes, "Are you well, Ro?" she asked him softly. Marten stood beside her, a heavy, disturbing hand near the juncture of her white shoulder and white neck, smiling on them both. His brown eyes were dark to the point of blackness with smiling. "Yes," he said. "Your studies go well? Van A is pleased? And Court?" Her mouth worked at this second name, as if she had tasted something bitter. "I'm trying," he said. They both knew he was not flashingly intelligent like Cuthbert, or even quick like Jamie. He was a plodder and a bludgeoner. Even Elaine was better at studies. And David? She knew his affection for the hawk. The boy looked up at Marten, still smiling paternally down on all this. Past his prime. His mother seemed to wince. For a moment, Marten's face seemed to darken, his grip on her shoulder to tighten. Then she looked out into the hot whiteness of the day, and all was as it had been. It's a charade, he thought. A game. Who is playing with whom? So we have this contrast of the dark sorcerer's hand on Gabrielle's white shoulder and white neck, and the darkness of his eyes and the blackness of his smile. So very obvious dark and light imagery there. The reaction to Court's name tells us so much about Gabrielle, just in the way that her mouth kind of moves, and she is asking in this bitter kind of way. She doesn't like this at all. She doesn't like Court. She doesn't like that Roland is training to become a gunslinger. She doesn't like this system. We can probably guess that she doesn't like being a part of this world where women are not important, pushed to the side. Your babies are taken away from you. The men are the important ones here. The gunslingers, the fathers, the guns, not the women. Just not really. So she doesn't like any of this. And is her being with Marten, is it that she's enchanted? This is a magical spell and she has no free will here? Or is she aligning with him because she doesn't like the politics of this community, government, whatever this thing is? We know that there's a revolution going on. There's a resistance to the gunslingers. We know now that she's not a big fan. So what is she doing with Marten? We don't have any answer to that, but probably important questions to ask. And then Roland, of course, mentioning the adult games again and again. We're just getting that again and again here. So Jake is going to have some things to say about games after the story is done, they have the same idea. Adults are being deceitful. It's all just a show. They're playing games. Roland and Jake are expressing exactly the same sentiments. One of them, though, is a big fat hypocrite. Guess which one? So this scene in the bedroom is the trigger point. It gets a little heated there, past his prime, and then Roland starts calling Marten bondsman. My mother didn't tell me I could leave, because Marten's like, go on, leave. And he's like, my mother has not dismissed me, bondsman. And ultimately, Marten's like, not really listening to this. Roland's kind of bringing into the conversation this hierarchy of like, I'm a king's son and you're nothing, but doesn't work on Marten. And Marten says, go find your hand, boy. So it's not a nice ending, and it enrages Roland. He's so angry that this, with the knowledge of his mother and Marten dancing, this is the treachery of Marten. So it is really just having an affair with your mom and kind of being mean to you, not bowing down to your highness, Prince Roland. He gets so mad that he's like, I'm going to become a gunslinger right now so that I can get my gun and go shoot this guy and get rid of him because he's trash. And he barges out, goes to Court's hut, kicks the door down, throws the table across the room, and he's like, I'm ready. Let's go. Let's do this. Now, Court, we met in the courtyard where he was bashing these kids so that their ears were bleeding, and we weren't quite sure what to think of this man. But we see here that he loves Roland. There is a ritual involved here of how a gunslinger in training will ask to become a gunslinger. It's a very formal system, and we see it on the Court during the test as well. But Court breaks that tradition, and he says, I will ask only once. Will you cry off? So I don't think that's part of how this is supposed to go. And he says, I'm only going to say this once, but he says it twice more in this exchange. He doesn't want to beat Roland. He doesn't want Roland to be sent west. He is kind of like, just cool your jets, bro. Just calm down and don't do this thing. But Roland's having none of it. And so they go to the test of the gunslinger. And nobody knows about this because it was unexpected. Roland, we're told, is the youngest at 14. His father had been the youngest before that at 16. His friends kind of get wind of it, and they're like, oh my God, let's go. This is happening. So they run over to watch, but nobody else is there. And King tells us about what the court situation is, what this field is where the boys go for this final test. He writes, many boys had left the corridor from the east end, where the teacher had always entered, as men. The east end faced the great hall and all the civilization and intrigue of the lighted world. Many more had slunk away, beaten and bloody, from the west end, where the boys always entered, as boys forever. The west end faced the farms and the hut dwellers beyond the farms. Beyond that, the tangled barbarian forests. Beyond that, Garland. And beyond Garland, the Mohane Desert. The boy who became a man progressed from darkness and unlearning to light and responsibility. So this light and dark imagery again in the east, the sun rises in the east, it sets in the west, and we have the setup of this situation where the east is where the victorious gunslingers go when they're finished, and then the boy, signifying the boy moving from the darkness of ignorance into the light of knowledge. And we know that Roland just crossed the Mohaine Desert, so why is he on that trajectory? We assume that he went out of Gilead through that west gate and through all of these other places, and then across the Mohaine Desert. So why are we going that way? Why are we on a quest towards the darkness? No answers yet. So they have the showdown. Roland uses David as his weapon. So he's been befriending David and knows that he's going to sacrifice him to further his own goals. He fights with Court, but it's not a very long battle because Court is taken off guard. He doesn't understand what Roland means by David is my weapon. Roland throws David into Court's face, hoping that David will be the sacrifice and not just fly away. And David does attack Court viciously, and he's killed. David the Hawk it's an awful scene. He's brutally killed in this ensuing fight, but he really gets Court as well. He's ripping out his eyeballs and clawing his face to shreds, and it's pretty gruesome. It's pretty great. It's a pretty great battle scene. We enjoy it. But he did sacrifice his friend here, and Court almost dies too. So Court is almost sacrificed in Roland's anger at the treachery of Marten. So almost two sacrifices here. But Roland wins the day, and Court's like almost unconscious, and Roland's like, no, you got to give me the keys so I can go get my guns. And Court says to him, wait. And Roland's like, what did you say? And Court's like, just wait. Just listen to me one more time and don't go shoot Marten in the face. Yeah, we all know. He's banging your mom. Okay, not great, but like, don't do this. And Roland doesn't. He does take that last bit of advice and kind of cools his jets and doesn't go after Marten right away here. So Court saves Roland's butt, I think. Interesting to know what would have happened if Court Interesting to see what would have happened if Court had not told him to do that, or if Roland hadn't listened. He goes to see his friend Cuthbert. So all the boys are like, oh my God, that just happened. And King writes, there was a speculative open light in Bert's eyes, and the gunslinger controlled only with great difficulty the need to tell him not to call for the test for a year or even 18 months, lest he go west. But they had been through a great ordeal together, and the gunslinger did not feel he could risk saying such a thing without a look on his face that might be taken for arrogance. I've begun to scheme, he thought, and was a little dismayed. Then he thought of Marten, of his mother, and smiled a deceiver's smile at his friend. That's important. So this sacrifice of David, the besting of Court, has changed him. And he is a schemer now. And he's like, oh, I don't want to be arrogant. But then he's like, but Marten. And then I'm a scheming deceiver. So that very small change at the end of this test is just magnified now in what we're looking at in his situation with Jake. So the scheming, the lying, the betrayals, it started small and it's ballooned up into the situation that we find Roland in right now. So this was the first step on this psychological path towards becoming not a great person, Roland, in this book. I did ask you early on, what do you think Stephen King thinks of guns? And I'm going to ask you again, have you thought any more about that? What about after this trial and test? What about how we're seeing how it's changing Roland? These guns are changing Roland into this liar, this deceiving person. I think the answer is nuanced, as all answers like this, but I think King has some feelings about this, and it's not when you look at the cover of the book and you're like, wow, look at the gunslingers, guns are so cool. That's not the message that we're really getting within the subtext here, or the text itself, really. So that wraps up this section. I'm going to stop here. That was part 1 of chapter 4, and we're going to come back and do part 2 of chapter 4, because we're only halfway through the chapter. It's just so much to talk about and think about. I'm so glad that you're with me on this journey. Can't wait to come back and finish the chapter, although it's going to be pretty sad. So stay tuned. Come on back to part 2 of chapter 4. Until we meet again, long days and pleasant nights.